Dawn broke over the Black Sea like a whisper, pale light stretching across waters that had witnessed 1,000 conflicts. At 0547 hours, the morning seemed ordinary. Russian coastal radar stations hummed with their routine sweeps, operators sipping coffee and watching green dots pulse across their screens. For 3 years, these installations had been the electronic eyes of the coastline, tracking every fishing boat, every cargo vessel, every shadow that dared approach their waters. They felt untouchable behind layers of jamming equipment, surface-to-air missiles, and the quiet confidence that comes from controlling the horizon. But this morning would shatter that confidence in ways no one could predict. The first anomaly appeared at 0549 hours. Not on radar screens, not through satellite feeds, but in something far more subtle. The morning fog that had been forecast to lift by 0600 instead thickened, rolling inland with unusual density. Weather stations recorded humidity spikes that made no meteorological sense. What looked like natural phenomenon was actually the opening move in a chess game where the pieces were invisible and the board stretched across hundreds of kilometers of contested coastline. Hidden beneath that unnatural fog, a different kind of war machine had been waiting. For 72 hours, autonomous naval drones no larger than jet skis had been drifting in the current, their systems in deep hibernation mode. Solar panels disguised as marine debris kept their batteries charged while they mimicked the motion of floating wreckage. To satellite surveillance, they appeared as nothing more than the scattered remnants of previous battles. But inside each hull, sophisticated electronics waited for a single encrypted pulse that would transform them from debris into weapons. The pulse came at 0551 hours, a millisecond burst of data transmitted from a facility so well hidden that its location remains classified to this day. Across 40 kilometers of ocean, 12 dormant machines awakened simultaneously. Their electric motors engaged with barely a whisper, propelling them toward coordinates they had been memorizing for weeks. Each drone carried not explosives, but something far more devastating to modern warfare. Electronic warfare packages designed to blind, confuse, and ultimately silence the digital nervous system that kept the coastal defenses operational. What happened next would redefine how naval conflicts are fought in the 21st century. But to understand the true genius of this operation, we need to step back and examine how 3 months of patient observation had identified a weakness that no one thought existed. Because this attack did not succeed through overwhelming force or advanced technology. It succeeded because someone had been watching, learning, and waiting for the exact moment when routine would become vulnerability. The radar operators never saw it coming. Their screens continued showing the familiar pattern of commercial shipping lanes, fishing vessels, and the occasional patrol craft. Every sweep looked normal because the attacking drones had learned to move like ghosts. They synchronized their movement with the natural rhythm of the waves, accelerating during the brief moments when radar beams swept elsewhere, then drifting motionless when the electronic gaze returned. This technique, known as pulse surfing, required computational precision beyond human capability. Each drone calculated its position 400 times per second, predicting radar sweep patterns and ocean currents with mathematical accuracy that turned the sea itself into camouflage. At 0556 hours, the first drone reached its position 2 kilometers offshore from the primary radar installation. From this distance, its onboard sensors began mapping the electromagnetic signature of the facility. Every radio transmission, every radar pulse, every electronic heartbeat was cataloged and analyzed. The installation was not just being watched, it was being diagnosed. Like a digital physician examining a patient, the drone identified which frequencies carried critical data, which communication channels coordinated defensive responses, and which systems would cause the most damage if disrupted. The second phase began without fanfare or warning. At 0558 hours, while operators inside the facility performed their routine morning system checks, invisible electronic warfare began. The drones did not jam the radar in the traditional sense. Instead, they began injecting carefully crafted false signals into the communication networks. Ghost contacts appeared on screens, phantom aircraft signatures that drew attention skyward while the real threat remained on the water. Operators found themselves chasing targets that existed only in the digital realm, their defensive systems firing at electronic phantoms while the true attack continued undetected. But this was merely the opening movement of a much larger symphony of destruction. Because while the coastal radar stations were being systematically blinded, a second wave of machines was already moving into position. These were not the small naval drones that had initiated the electronic assault. These were something entirely different, larger, faster, and carrying payloads designed not to destroy buildings, but to sever the communication links that connected the coastal defenses to the broader military network. The operators inside the radar facility remained unaware that their electronic eyes had been compromised. Their screens still showed contacts, their communication systems still crackled with radio traffic, and their automated systems continued reporting normal status. What they did not realize was that they were now looking at a carefully constructed illusion. The real ocean, the real tactical situation, and the real danger approaching their position existed in a parallel reality that their instruments could no longer perceive. At 06:04 hours, 17 minutes after the initial pulse that had awakened the sleeping machines, the first physical contact was made. Not an explosion, not a missile strike, but something far more sophisticated. A magnetic clamp attaching to the underwater cable that carried internet and communication data between the coastal facility and regional command centers. Within seconds, fiber optic lines that had carried terabytes of military intelligence were compromised by devices no larger than briefcases. The facility had not lost its ability to see. It had lost its ability to tell anyone what it was seeing. And this was where the true genius of the operation revealed itself. Because the goal was never to destroy the radar stations. The goal was to isolate them, to turn them into islands of information that could observe but never communicate, watch but never warn. In the span of 20 minutes, a network that had taken years to construct and billions to maintain had been surgically separated from the very forces it was designed to protect. The morning fog began to lift at 0612 hours, revealing an ocean that looked exactly as it had at dawn. But beneath that deceptive calm, the balance of power along hundreds of kilometers of coastline had shifted permanently. What came next would test whether traditional military doctrine could adapt to a form of warfare that existed primarily in the electromagnetic spectrum, where victory was measured not in territory captured, but in information controlled. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any explosion could have been. At 0615 hours, operators inside 3 separate coastal installations began noticing discrepancies that made no sense. Communication logs showed successful data transmission to regional command, but acknowledgement signals were absent. Backup channels reported normal function, yet responses from headquarters never arrived. It was as if their messages were being sent into a void, swallowed by an electronic darkness that consumed information without leaving traces. Lieutenant Commander Alexei Petrov stared at his console, watching status indicators that should have provided reassurance, but instead deepened his confusion. Every system showed green. Every diagnostic returned normal parameters. Yet something fundamental had changed in the last 20 minutes, something his instruments could not quantify or identify. The morning routine that had begun with coffee and casual conversation had transformed into a puzzle where the pieces no longer fit together properly. 300 kilometers away, in a hardened command bunker, duty officers faced their own growing alarm. Coastal Station Alpha had gone silent at Y608 hours. Station Beta followed at U611. Station Gamma maintained communication until U614. Then vanished from the network as completely as if it had never existed. Standard protocol called for immediate investigation, But investigation required knowing what to investigate. The stations were not destroyed, not captured, not obviously compromised. They had simply become unreachable, islands of electronics floating in a sea of severed connections. What the command staff could not see was the elegant precision of the trap that had been sprung. Each coastal facility remained fully operational within its own limited sphere. Radar arrays continued their sweeps, computers processed data, personnel performed their duties with mechanical efficiency. But the threads that bound these installations to the larger military machine had been cut with surgical accuracy. They could see everything and communicate nothing, a form of technological blindness that no contingency plan had anticipated. The drones responsible for this digital amputation had already begun their next phase. Having successfully isolated their targets, they repositioned themselves for the final stroke. Advanced sonar mapping revealed the precise locations of underwater communication cables, power lines, and backup data links that connected the coast to inland facilities. These lifelines, buried beneath meters of sand and rock, had been considered impervious to conventional attack. They were not impervious to patient machines that could work underwater for hours without detection. At 06:23 hours, the first backup cable was severed. Not destroyed with explosives that would leave obvious evidence, but cut with precision tools that made the break appear accidental. A fiber optic line that had carried encrypted military communications for 18 months suddenly went dark, its failure attributed to routine equipment malfunction by automated diagnostic systems. The second cable followed at 0627, then the third at 0631. Each cut was spaced precisely to avoid triggering cascade failure protocols that might alert distant monitoring stations. Inside the coastal facilities, technicians began troubleshooting problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be addressed. Communication arrays that had functioned flawlessly for years now produced intermittent failures. Backup systems activated and deactivated without clear cause. Status lights flickered between green and amber in patterns that suggested mechanical failure rather than enemy action. Every symptom pointed toward aging infrastructure reaching the end of its operational life, a convenient explanation that masked the true source of their isolation. The psychological effect was as devastating as the technical impact. Military communications depend on certainty, on the reliable flow of information that allows commanders to make decisions based on accurate intelligence. When that flow becomes unreliable, when status reports arrive corrupted or delayed, when confirmation signals vanish into electronic noise, the entire command structure begins to question its own perceptions. Were the radar contacts real or false? Was the silence from headquarters meaningful or accidental? In the absence of reliable communication, doubt becomes the enemy's most powerful weapon. By 0640 hours, the transformation was complete. 9 coastal radar installations that had formed an integrated defensive network now operated as isolated outposts, their electronic voices silenced by invisible hands. Regional command centers found themselves blind to conditions along hundreds of kilometers of strategically vital coastline. Emergency communication protocols, designed for equipment failure or natural disaster, proved inadequate for a form of warfare that left no physical evidence of its passage. The true brilliance of the operation lay not in its technical complexity, but in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to destroy heavily defended installations, the attackers had simply unplugged them from the network they served. Like removing fuses from a circuit board, the action required minimal force but achieved maximum disruption. Coastal defenses remained intact but ineffective, powerful but purposeless, operational but isolated. What happened next would reveal the second phase of a plan that had been months in the making. Because silencing the coastal radar was never the final objective. It was preparation for something larger, something that would exploit the electronic darkness that now shrouded the shoreline. The fog that had provided cover for the initial attack was lifting, revealing an ocean that appeared empty and peaceful. But beneath that deceptive calm, forces were already moving toward their next objectives, guided by intelligence gathered during those crucial minutes when the coast had been blind and silent. The morning that had begun with routine confidence was about to become a lesson in how modern warfare could be waged without firing a single conventional shot. Victory would not be measured in territory captured or installations destroyed, but in information controlled and communications severed. The age of electronic warfare had announced itself with a whisper, leaving defenders to wonder what other invisible weapons might already be moving through their compromised networks, waiting for the perfect moment to complete what had begun at dawn. Dawn. By 0700 hours, the sun had burned away the last traces of fog, revealing a coastline that looked exactly as it had the day before. Guard towers stood unchanged. Radar dishes continued their eternal rotations, and personnel carried out their morning duties with the same mechanical precision they had maintained for years. Yet everything had changed in ways that would not become apparent for hours, perhaps days to come. 3 months of patient observation had culminated in 23 minutes of surgical precision, transforming a defensive network into isolated islands of confusion. The true genius of the operation was not in the technology employed, but in its restraint. No explosions marked the moment of victory. No dramatic footage would appear on news networks. Instead, the attack had succeeded through something far more devastating than destruction. Through the quiet severing of connections that turned strength into weakness, coordination into chaos. Modern warfare had evolved beyond the need for overwhelming force, proving that in an age of digital dependence, the most powerful weapon might be silence itself. This morning would be studied for decades by military strategists trying to understand how electronic warfare could achieve strategic objectives without conventional combat. But for now, as operators stared at status boards that told them everything was normal while their instincts screamed otherwise, only one question remained. If this level of disruption could be achieved so quietly, so completely, what other invisible wars were already being fought in the spaces between the signals, in the darkness between the data streams, where victory whispers rather than roars?